Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something wild. How a single, ancient sentence literally rewired the trajectory of a major world religion. We're going to see how it changed not just individual beliefs, but the entire direction of the church as we know it.
Okay, let's look at this incredibly famous verse and, honestly, just acknowledge its massive cultural and theological weight. If you've spent, any time around Western Christianity, you've definitely heard John 14:6. I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. It's easily one of the most quoted texts in the New Testament, and it effectively forms the absolute bedrock of modern Christian doctrine.
Now, traditionally, this verse is taught as a highly exclusive doctrine. It essentially sets Jesus up as the strict gatekeeper to the divine, like the absolute only way to God the Father. This standard modern interpretation creates a pretty rigid requirement, right? It says you must become a Christian, and salvation is tied solely to faith in Jesus' death on the cross. So this specific reading introduced a really distinct concept of exclusivity into the faith, basically declaring all other methods or paths completely false.
But what if centuries of modern theology are actually hiding the original meaning? We're going to look closely at the historical text today to figure that out. Was this verse always meant to be this strict requirement for salvation, or has history completely reshaped its intent?
Section 1. The original Hebrew context. Let's uncover that first-century setting.
So let's see what happens when we strip away our Western assumptions and place Jesus right back into his first-century Jewish environment. When we do that, wow, a stark contrast emerges. As you can see, modern theology views Jesus as a bridge to God via the cross. But in his actual first-century context, Jesus was speaking to his Jewish disciples about preparing a place in his Father's house. When they asked him the way, Jesus wasn't presenting some brand new religion of the cross. He was actually pointing them to the righteous path laid out in God's law, the Torah. In Jewish thought, following the Torah is completely synonymous with following the way of God. The crucial takeaway here is that he was pointing them to a very specific, already established righteous path.
And this is absolutely crucial context for John 14:6. If you look at the book of Acts, the early followers of Jesus weren't starting a brand new, completely separate religion. Not at all. They were simply members of a Jewish sect, literally known as the Way. They worshiped the God of Israel, and they faithfully observed Jewish law. Even Paul himself identified as a follower of the Way, while strictly affirming his adherence to the law and the prophets. So when Jesus says, I am the way, he's very likely talking about this specific Torah-observant lifestyle and community, rather than some metaphysical, exclusive bridge to heaven.
Moving on to Section 2, the Hellenistic translation shift, from Eastern roots to Greek philosophy. Now, if the original meaning was all about living the Torah, we really have to ask, how did it become a doctrine of exclusivity that completely changed the direction of the church forever? Well, this translation shift from Hebrew to Greek introduced subtle yet massive conceptual changes. Think about how much gets lost in translation today, just going from English to Spanish. Now imagine translating ancient Hebrew concepts into ancient Greek. It's a huge leap. For example, the Hebrew name Yeshua, meaning salvation, was translated into the Greek Iesus just to fit Romanized naming styles. The Hebrew word Alma, meaning young woman, was translated by some into Parthenos, meaning virgin, which instantly brought in heavy Greek mythological associations of gods and mortals. And Mashiach, the Anointed One, that became Christos, shifting it from a Jewish title to a very Greek one. So when the words changed, the entire cultural framework changed right along with them.
Because of this, early readers were suddenly interpreting a Jewish teacher through the completely foreign lens of Greek Platonism and mythology. On one hand, you have the Eastern roots, devout Jews relying entirely on the Hebrew scriptures and earthy, tangible kingdoms. But as the texts were translated and moved west, they collided head-on with Greco-Roman concepts. Suddenly, abstract Platonic ideas, concepts of an immortal soul, and Hellenistic language began layering over the original Jewish teachings. Imagine trying to understand a deeply Eastern, grounded philosophy, but the only tool you have is a dictionary written by ancient Greek philosophers. The core meaning is bound to change dramatically, right?
Let's look at Section 3, a timeline of transformation, the centuries of change. To really grasp the scale of this shift, we need to map out the early church's development chronologically, because, this rewiring didn't just happen overnight. Step by step, over hundreds of years, non-Hebraic, philosophical ideologies slowly took root. Between 70 and 150 CE, we see a distinct shift away from physical Israel toward a spiritualized church along with a growing rejection of the Torah. Then, from 150 to 250 CE, early apologists like Tertullian start introducing entirely new concepts like the Trinity. Between 200 and 350 CE, the Alexandrian school officially adopts Greek Platonism to explain the faith. And finally, between 325 and 430 CE, formal, rigid dogmas are officially established. By this point, the interpretation of verses like John 14:6 had morphed completely to fit these newly established parameters.
Let's actually drill down into one of those evolving doctrines to see how this worked in practice. As historical texts reveal, foundational ideas like the Trinity weren't instantaneous divine revelations. They were actually complex theological constructs negotiated by men over centuries. The early 2nd century church actually held a binitarian view, seeing the Father as God and Jesus as divine, but not in a modern Trinitarian sense at all. It wasn't until the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE that the Greek philosophical term homoousios, meaning same essence, was introduced. The Trinity as we know it today evolved through intense philosophical debates, not plain biblical text, and eventually became formalized church tradition. And it is exactly this type of formalized, exclusive theology that relied so heavily on the new, Hellenized interpretations of verses like John 14:6 to enforce its boundaries.
Which brings us to Section 4, a new Western subculture, rewiring the faith.
This really highlights the profound, overarching impact of translating a Hebrew reality into a Greek world. Our sources note that the Greek New Testament utilized Hellenistic language and mythological associations that significantly rewired the faith into a Western subculture, one completely distant from its Eastern origins. What we're left looking at is a modern religion that, through centuries of translation and cultural shifting, evolved far, far away from its Torah-observant roots. A verse like John 14:6, which was originally a grounded call to follow the righteous path of the Torah, got rewired by this Hellenistic shift into an exclusive gatekeeping doctrine that fundamentally changed the direction of the church forever.
Ultimately, uncovering the historical truth of texts like John 14:6 really shouldn't be feared. Truth is never afraid of questions. Honestly, it's always better understood through them. By looking at these linguistic shifts, the cultural changes, and the historical timelines, we gain a much clearer picture of how a faith evolved from a localized Jewish sect into a massive Western religion. But it does leave us with a massive question to consider. If a single sentence in John 14:6 could be rewired so drastically as to change the entire direction of a world religion, what other foundational beliefs might be lost in translation?